Octavio Paz won the 1990 Nobel Prize for Literature. His grandfather was a novelist who pleaded the cause of the Indians displaced by the Spanish, and his father was a lawyer who was a supporter of Emiliano Zapata. We dealt with Zapata in the Mexican Revolution earlier. It is no wonder, then, that Paz was devoted to the causes of indigenous people, that Paz was an active force in Mexican culture. Perhaps the most significant event in the education of Octavio Paz was his invitation to participation in the 1937 Second International Congress of Anti-Fascist Writers in Republican Spain. There were the world poets, Pablo Neruda himself, André Malraux, Stephen Spender. And at that conference, Paz began to realize that he had a complex task before him. He needed to be able to write poetry that wasn't alienated from history, and poetry that wasn't simply pure and detached poetry. But at the same time, he realized that he needed not to be limited by the historic or propagandistic dogma of his time. How did he solve this problem? Well, the poem Obsidian Butterfly gives you an idea of how he solved that, published in 1950. And one of his solutions, and there were many that he pursued during his career, is that of surrealism. You'll recall that we discussed the idea, the technique of surrealism earlier in Julio Cortázar's House Taking Over. In surrealism, you'll recall the reader is asked to focus on beyond what is immediately realistic and rational to what is deeply true. We spoke of Kafka's The Metamorphosis as another example of that from the European tradition. In the poem Obsidian Butterfly, we hear the voice of a spirit of an ancient Mexican goddess. The goddess, as Paz writes, the mother of flint and star, bearer of the ray, is no longer a goddess, but instead now a blue feather that a bird loses in the brambles. The poem is one of loss, and the poet gives us a sense of the loss of a Mexican civilization. This idea of loss is also pursued in Rosalio's Castellanos, laments the loss of an indigenous culture in the short story Death of the Tiger. Here the writer examines a Mexican tribe's fate at the hands of white men. Representatives of a tribe seek to regain their land, but are told that, and this is a quote, "In this speaking paper all truths are set." That statement made by a representative of the government. The idea, again, there of an oral tradition of the people, the indigenous people of that culture, versus a literate culture of those who have conquered that land. And the truth they are told is that this land, with its hillsides for good sowing of corn, with its fine forest to be felled for logs and firewood, with its rivers of good mills, is the property of those who came before, of conquistadors, of those who the author calls respectable slave trailers. Eventually, the members of the tribe look for work, but really are sent to a faraway form where eventually they die out. I think of all the literature that we've read in this section of the course, the fate of Native Americans is realistic, rendered in the interchange between the collector, the individual who's supposed to gather up farm workers, an agent for those who own farms, and the members of the Bolometic tribe. I suppose biographically it's significant also to note that Castellanos was born into an important landowning family in Mexico in 1925. When her family lost everything, she began to study in Mexico City. She found that she had a great sympathy for those who struggled. Her life as a cultural organizer, as a writer, as an ambassador to Israel is extraordinary. Extraordinary also is the career of Carlos Fuentes. He was Mexican ambassador to France from 1975 to 1977. He was and is a frequently popular lecturer in America and in European universities, and perhaps he's done as much as anyone else to teach the world about the literature of Latin America and the culture of Latin America. He is often as well critical as he was at his 1987 graduation address at Harvard University, in which he criticized the U.S. government's policies toward Latin America. What to read from Fuentes? I highly recommend his The Old Gringo, published in the United States in 1985. It's set against the background of the American Revolution. The novel fictionally portrays Ambrose Bierce, a North American writer who mysteriously disappeared in Mexico in 1914. Bierce, we know historically, had written in a letter the following: "To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia." It's assumed that Bierce joined the army of Pancho Villa and was killed in a battle. In the novel, however, Bierce joins forces but teams up with a younger general, Thomas Arroyo, and the novel is told from a woman's point of view, that of a Governess Harriet Winslow, who conjures up the ghost of her lover Arroyo and her surrogate father Bierce. The novel in 1988 was made into a film starring Jimmy Smits and Gregory Peck. The film, of course, is a departure from the novel, but still tells us something of Fuentes' talent. He remains today an eloquent spokesman of the history, culture, and identity of Latin America and the Caribbean, specifically of Mexico. What are we to say about these writers of Latin America and the Caribbean as an overview? Let me end these lectures with 3 notes. First, I think you've seen a commitment to experimentation. We've seen surrealism used. We've used new techniques employed, such as magical realism, which is really quite an interesting technique that captures what is fantastic with what is historically true and accurate. 2, we've seen in these writers a tendency to create a vision that's combined with historical consciousness. For these writers, history is a stimuli for thought, a method for thinking deeply about the human condition. And 3, and I've said this repeatedly in these lectures, the writers of Latin America and the Caribbean simply refuse to dissociate literature from life. They believe that literature has meaning, that literature is a creative means of expression, and in some cases that literature is a weapon against bureaucracy, against brutality, and against injustice.